Imagine a world where a massive British military campaign, designed to cripple Napoleon, crumbled not from enemy fire, but from a mysterious illness. This isn't fiction. Discover how the English sickness transformed Walcheren into a graveyard for Britain's grandest ambitions, and forever altered the course of history. The year is 1809, and the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte stretches across the entirety of continental Europe. The War of the Fifth Coalition is raging, a desperate struggle to contain the French Emperor's insatiable hunger for conquest. On the banks of the Danube, the Austrian Empire, Britain's beleaguered ally, is locked in a death grip with the Grande Armée. Vienna is trembling. The Austrians are begging London for relief, pleading for a diversion, anything that might force Napoleon to turn his gaze away from the East. In the corridors of power in Westminster, the pressure is palpable. War Minister Lord Castlereagh knows that if Austria falls, Britain will stand alone against a united, French-dominated Europe. A second front is not just a strategic option. It is a matter of national survival. But where to strike? The answer lies just across the North Sea, in the murky, tidal waters of the Scheldt estuary. Here sits the port of Antwerp, a location of such strategic importance that Napoleon himself famously described it as a pistol pointed at the heart of England. The Emperor has been busy transforming Antwerp into a naval fortress, constructing a massive fleet intended to challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy. Intelligence reports reaching London suggest that the city's defences are weak, its garrison depleted, and the French distracted by the carnage in Austria. The opportunity is irresistible. A swift, decisive strike, a coup de main, could seize the island of Walcheren at the mouth of the river, smash the dockyards, and burn the French fleet at anchor. It is a bold, aggressive plan intended to secure Britain's safety and save her ally in one stroke. To achieve this grand design, the British government assembles a force of truly staggering proportions. Nothing like it has ever been seen in the history of the island nation. Throughout the summer of 1809, the ports of southern England bustle with frenetic energy. Nearly 40,000 soldiers are mustered, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, including the finest guards regiments and elite light infantry divisions. They are supported by 15,000 horses and a colossal armada. 264 ships of war and 352 transports crowd the anchorage at the Downs, their masts creating a veritable forest upon the water. It is the largest expeditionary force ever to leave British shores, a hammer blow poised to crush the French defences. However, beneath the pageantry and the martial splendour, cracks are already forming in the foundation of the enterprise. Such a massive machine requires a commander of singular vision and drive. Instead, the political machinery of the day appoints John Pitt, the second Earl of Chatham. The brother of the late Prime Minister, William Pitt, Chatham is a man known more for his high connections than his martial vigour. His reputation is one of lethargy and notorious lateness, a man who rises at noon and conducts war at a gentleman's pace. To command the naval element, the Admiralty appoints Sir Richard Strachan, a brave but impatient officer. This pairing of the lethargic Earl and the impulsive Admiral creates a command structure defined not by unity, but by friction. Yet, as the great fleet weighs anchor in late July, optimism reigns supreme. The soldiers, resplendent in their red coats, crowd the decks, cheering as the white cliffs fade into the mist. They believe they are sailing to glory, to a quick and decisive victory over the French. They envision storming the ramparts of Antwerp and returning home as heroes before the autumn leaves turn. None of them can see the invisible enemy waiting for them in the low-lying polders of the Dutch coast. They do not know that they are sailing not toward a battlefield of glory, but into a biological trap. The French cannon are not the true threat. The English sickness is waiting, and it will prove to be a foe far more formidable than any Marshal of France. On the morning of July 30th, 1809, the residents of the Dutch coast awoke to a sight that defied comprehension. The horizon was no longer a line of sea and sky, but a wall of wood and canvas. The British Armada had arrived. To the terrified French sentries posted along the dunes of Walcheren, it must have seemed as though the entire might of the British Empire had materialized from the sea mist. The landings began at the Brisand, a stretch of beach on the northern side of the island. Unlike the bloody, contested landings of future wars, this initial push met with surprisingly light resistance. The French forces, scattered and unprepared for an invasion of this magnitude, largely melted away before the waves of Redcoats wading through the surf. The early reports sent back to the flagship were jubilant. The beachhead was secure. The British Army was ashore on enemy soil, and the operation, so complex on paper, appeared to be unfolding with the precision of a drill-square maneuver. General Sir John Hope, a capable and energetic officer, immediately pushed his division forward to the neighbouring island of South Beveland. His movement was swift and decisive, capturing key positions and effectively securing a pathway toward the ultimate prize, Antwerp. At this moment, the French defences were in disarray. The road to the dockyards lay open, the pistol pointed at the heart of England, unguarded and vulnerable. A rapid advance, a forced march of a few days, might have ended the campaign in a glorious stroke of strategic genius. But here, the lethal friction of command began to grind the gears of the expedition to a halt. The Earl of Chatham, armed with his massive siege train and heavy artillery, turned his gaze not toward the distant prize of Antwerp, but toward the immediate obstacle of Flushing. This fortified port on the southern tip of Walcheren was a thorn in the side of the navy, certainly, but military doctrine and common sense dictated that speed was the essence of a coup de main. Yet, Chatham hesitated. Rather than bypassing the town or masking it with a smaller force, while the main army raced inland, he decided to bring the full weight of his expedition to bear upon it. The army halted. The momentum, that most precious commodity in warfare, began to bleed away into the sandy soil. For nearly 2 weeks, the British Army busied itself with the formal rituals of 18th century siege warfare. Trenches were dug, batteries were established, and heavy mortars were dragged through the mire. Then the bombardment began. It was a display of firepower that shook the very foundations of the island. For days, the sky over Flushing was choked with smoke as British cannons and the terrifying new Congreve rockets rained destruction upon the town. The French garrison, trapped and outgunned, endured a hellscape of exploding shells and crumbling masonry. The town hall, the churches, and the homes of the Dutch civilians were reduced to rubble. Finally, on August 15th, the silence returned. The French commander, seeing the hopelessness of his position, surrendered. The Union Jack was hoisted above the smoking ruins of Flushing. To the soldiers cheering in the ranks, it felt like a magnificent victory. They had smashed a fortified city and taken thousands of prisoners with minimal losses. Bands played and officers toasted the success in their mess tents. In London, the news was greeted with relief and celebration. The first phase of the grand strategy was complete. However, amidst the smoke of celebration, a darker reality was taking hold. The capture of Flushing had cost the expedition something far more valuable than gunpowder: time. 2 critical weeks had vanished. While Chatham congratulated himself on a textbook siege, the French marshals were frantically rushing reinforcements to Antwerp. They were flooding the polders, turning the fields into impassable lakes, and strengthening the crumbling walls of the city. The window of opportunity, once wide open, was beginning to creak shut. Moreover, the British Army was now stationary, camped not on solid ground, but on the low-lying sodden polders of Walcheren. This was land reclaimed from the sea, sitting below the high tide mark, a landscape of stagnant ditches, brackish water, and humid air. It was late summer, a time the locals knew well as the fever season. As the adrenaline of the bombardment faded, the soldiers found themselves billeted in damp barns or sleeping on the wet earth, surrounded by the foul miasma of the marshes. The air was thick with insects, and the water they drank was tainted. The victory at Flushing had been won, but the army was now idling in a biological kill zone, utterly unaware that the ground beneath their boots was about to turn against them with a vengeance. The silence that followed the fall of Flushing was not the peaceful quiet of victory. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of the grave. As the British army settled into its encampments, waiting for orders that never seemed to come, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. It began innocuously enough. A soldier on picket duty would complain of a sudden chill despite the humid August air. Another would collapse during roll call, his face flushed, his eyes burning with an unnatural brightness. At first, the regimental surgeons dismissed these cases as simple fatigue or the result of damp bivouacs. But within days, the trickle of sick men turned into a deluge. The English sickness had arrived, and it would prove to be a far more ruthless executioner than the French artillery. The malady was a complex and deadly cocktail, a biological perfect storm brewed in the stagnant waters of the Scheldt. It was a combination of malaria, known then as the ague, typhus, typhoid, and dysentery. The medical science of 1809 was woefully ill-equipped to understand the vector of the mosquito, teeming in the millions above the brackish ditches where the soldiers filled their canteens. To the men, it seemed as though the very air they breathed, the foul-smelling miasma rising from the mud, was poisoning them. The symptoms were horrific and rapid. A healthy, strapping grenadier could be reduced to a shivering, delirious wreck within hours. Violent tremors would shake their bodies so hard that the teeth chattered in their skulls, followed by raging fevers that burned through their constitutions, leaving them gaunt and yellowed. By early September, the situation had spiraled into a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The number of men unfit for duty skyrocketed from a few hundred to over 12,000. Entire regiments ceased to function as military units, transformed instead into wandering ghosts. The pomp and pageantry of the parade ground vanished, replaced by the groans of the dying and the constant, demoralizing sight of burial parties digging shallow graves in the waterlogged soil. The army was no longer fighting a war, it was fighting a plague. The medical infrastructure of the expedition, designed to treat shrapnel wounds and saber cuts, collapsed under the weight of the epidemic. The sick were crammed into makeshift hospitals in the town of Middelburg, damp barns, commandeered warehouses, and churches where the pews had been ripped out. There was no bedding. Men lay on the bare, stone floors, wrapped only in their greatcoats, huddled together in their own filth. The air in these charnel houses was so foul that strong men retched upon entering. In these dark, overcrowded halls, typhus and dysentery spread like wildfire, finishing off those weakened by the malaria. Compounding the tragedy was a criminally negligent lack of supplies. The only known effective treatment for the ague was Jesuit's bark or quinine, often administered with port wine to bolster the patient's strength. Yet, the medical board in London, in a display of bureaucratic incompetence that bordered on manslaughter, had supplied virtually none. Surgeons watched helplessly as their patients wasted away, having nothing to offer them but purgatives and bloodletting, treatments that only hastened death. Desperate requests were sent across the Channel, begging for bark and wine, but the supply ships were tangled in red tape, leaving the doctors to fight a forest fire with empty buckets. The impact on morale was devastating. Soldiers are prepared to die in battle. They are trained to face the cannon's roar and the cavalry charge. But to watch their comrades turn yellow and rot in a barn, without ever seeing the enemy, destroyed the spirit of the army. A profound lethargy settled over the ranks. The discipline that made the Redcoat the envy of Europe began to disintegrate. Why polish a musket or stand to attention when you would likely be dead of fever by the weekend? The French, observing from a distance, realized they no longer needed to risk their own lives. They simply had to wait. The English sickness was doing their work for them, dismantling the grandest expedition of the age, one feverish soldier at a time. The army was not being defeated, It was dissolving. While the unseen microbial enemy ravaged the ranks from within, the visible machinery of the expedition was grinding to a catastrophic halt. An army of 40,000 men is a voracious beast. It requires a river of food, ammunition, and, most critically, fresh water to survive. Here, the logistical planning of the British operation revealed itself to be as hollow as the grand strategy itself. The wells on Walcheren were few and shallow, quickly drained by the thirsty multitude. The Quartermaster General's department, overwhelmed and disorganized, failed to secure a reliable supply of potable water from England. Driven by a thirst that burned as hot as their fevers, soldiers were forced to turn to the only source available, the stagnant, green-scummed ditches that crisscrossed the polders. It was a fatal circle of cause and effect. The very water they drank to cool their fevered brows was teeming with the bacteria that caused dysentery, accelerating the spread of the disease and weakening the men further. The supply chain, which had functioned well enough during the initial landings, began to fracture under the strain of the occupation. Bread arrived mouldy, meat spoiled in the summer heat before it could reach the cook fires. But the most damning failure remained the lack of medical supplies. As the death toll mounted, the request for medicines became a desperate shout into the void, answered only by silence and bureaucratic delay from London. The Commissariat had prepared for a swift campaign of manoeuvre, not a static humanitarian disaster in a swamp. Yet this logistical nightmare was merely a symptom of a rot that started at the very head of the army. At headquarters, the Earl of Chatham remained in a state of baffling paralysis. With Flushing captured, the road to Antwerp beckoned, but Chatham did not move. He established himself in comfortable quarters, seemingly content with his minor victory, displaying a lack of urgency that bordered on criminal negligence. He held councils of war, wrote lengthy dispatches, and fussed over the details of garrison duty, all while the primary objective of the war lay just days away. The relationship between the army and the navy, the two arms of service that needed to work in perfect synchronization, degenerated into open hostility. Admiral Sir Richard Strachan, commanding the fleet, was eager to push up the Scheldt River, to smash the boom chains and engage the French fleet. But he could not move without the army securing the banks, and Chatham refused to advance until the navy had cleared the channel. It was a strategic standoff of the most absurd kind, a tragic comedy played out with live ammunition. The commanders became locked in a cycle of mutual blaming and waiting, immortalized in the biting public sentiment of the time. The Earl waiting for the Admiral, and the Admiral waiting for the Earl. While they bickered and drafted letters of complaint, the momentum of the campaign withered and died. While the British commanders played their game of statues, the French were galvanized into action. The initial shock of the invasion had worn off, replaced by a frenetic energy to save the Empire's northern fleet. Napoleon, far away in Austria, had dispatched Marshal Bernadotte to take command of the defences at Antwerp. Bernadotte was no lethargic aristocrat. He was a seasoned veteran of the Revolutionary Wars. He immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. He conscripted thousands of labourers and National Guardsmen to reinforce the city's crumbling walls. He mounted new batteries of cannon along the river bends, creating a gauntlet of fire that any approaching British ship would have to endure. Most ruthlessly, Bernadotte ordered the sluice gates opened. He flooded the countryside surrounding Antwerp, turning the approaches to the city into a vast, impassable lake. The open window that British intelligence had promised, the weak defences and the distracted garrison, had been slammed shut and barred. By the time Chatham finally considered moving his sick and demoralised army toward Batz at the end of August, the reality was staring him in the face. Antwerp was no longer a vulnerable prize. It was an impregnable fortress, manned by 30,000 French troops and surrounded by water. The coup de main was dead. The grand ambition of destroying Napoleon's fleet had been defeated not by a great battle, but by a failure to understand the value of time. The British army stood knee-deep in Dutch mud, looking down a road they could no longer travel, defeated by their own hesitation. The turning point was subtle but undeniable. It wasn't marked by a lost battle or a sunken ship, but by a realization that slowly dawned upon the British High Command like a cold winter sunrise. The moment for victory had passed. The coup de main, that swift lightning strike intended to catch the French sleeping, relied entirely on speed and surprise. Both were now long gone, squandered in the trenches of Flushing and the debating rooms of headquarters. By late August 1809, the strategic landscape had shifted fundamentally. Marshal Bernadotte's frenzied efforts had transformed Antwerp. The city, which weeks ago had been a panic-stricken port with crumbling walls, was now a bristling porcupine of defences. The French had reinforced the garrison not just with raw conscripts, but with hardened veterans rushed from depots across the empire. The Scheldt River, once an open highway for the Royal Navy, was now a deadly obstacle course. The French had stretched massive boom chains across the water, guarded by gunboats and newly constructed shore batteries that could rain red-hot shot upon any British vessel foolish enough to approach. Furthermore, the flooding of the polders around Antwerp had created a defensive moat miles wide. To besiege the city now would require a massive engineering effort, building causeways, draining fields, and transporting heavy siege guns through waist-deep mud, all under the fire of French artillery. It was a task that would daunt a fresh, healthy army. For Chatham's force, it was an impossibility. His regiments were no longer fighting units, they were mobile hospitals. A siege of Antwerp would not be a military operation, it would be a death march. The sheer physical capacity of the army to haul cannon and dig trenches had evaporated in the fever wards of Middelburg. The intelligence reports that finally trickled into Chatham's headquarters confirmed the grim reality. The French fleet, the primary target of the entire expedition, had been moved further upstream, well beyond the reach of the Royal Navy's guns, and protected by the city's new defences. The opportunity to burn the ships at anchor was gone. The grand strategic objective, to break the pistol pointed at the heart of England, had failed. This realization brought with it a crushing sense of paralysis. To advance was suicide. To retreat was a humiliation. For days the commanders debated their options, clutching at straws, hoping for a miracle that would not come. They looked at maps that no longer reflected the reality on the ground. They discussed flanked marches and naval bombardments that were now tactically impossible. It was the desperate bargaining of men who knew they had gambled the largest army in British history and lost. Meanwhile, the soldiers in the ranks knew the truth long before their generals admitted it. They saw the inactivity. They felt the lack of purpose. The rumours flew through the camp, whispers that the French were 50,000 strong, that the fleet was leaving, that they were to be abandoned in this swamp to rot. The spirit of the army, already battered by disease, broke under the weight of futility. There is nothing more demoralizing to a soldier than suffering for no purpose. To endure the freezing nights, the bad food, and the terrifying sickness, only to be told that the objective was abandoned, was a bitter pill to swallow. Finally, at a council of war on August 27th, the inevitable was spoken aloud. The commanders formally agreed that further offensive operations were impossible. The dream of seizing Antwerp was officially dead. The grand expedition, which had sailed with such fanfare and promise, was now reduced to a single ignominious question: how to extract a dying army from a hostile coast before it was completely annihilated by disease. The focus shifted from conquest to survival. The order was given to prepare for withdrawal. The ships that had brought a conquering army would now become ambulances for the defeated. The withdrawal began in early September, a sombre reversal of the triumphant landings just weeks prior. The vast armada, once a symbol of imperial might, now sat low in the water, burdened not with plunder, but with the broken bodies of British youth. Regiment after regiment marched to the embarkation points, But these were not the crisp, drilled formations that had paraded in England. They were shambling columns of gaunt, hollow-eyed men, many supported by their comrades, others carried on stretchers or in commandeered carts. The beaches of Walcheren, where they had stormed ashore with cheers, were now scenes of quiet misery. However, the tragedy was not yet over. In a final, baffling decision that would compound the disaster, the government in London ordered a garrison to remain behind. Despite the total failure of the main objective, the cabinet clung to the captured island of Walcheren as a bargaining chip, a token of success to justify the enormous expense of the campaign. 15,000 men were ordered to stay and hold the island, to keep the river closed. It was a death sentence. As autumn set in, the weather turned and the English sickness entered its deadliest phase. The garrison force, trapped on the pestilential island with no strategic purpose, simply continued to die. The hospitals were overflowing. The death carts rattled through the streets of Flushing day and night. The toll was so high that traditional military funerals were abandoned. Bodies were buried in mass graves without ceremony. The living were too weak to bury the dead. By December, when the order finally came to evacuate the last soldier, the garrison had been decimated. Before leaving, the engineers blew up the dockyards and fortifications of Flushing, a spiteful, hollow gesture of destruction that served only to underscore the futility of the entire endeavour. They left behind a ruined town and a landscape sown with British bones. The human cost of the Walcheren expedition was staggering. Of the nearly 40,000 men who sailed, over 4,000 died. But the statistic that truly reveals the horror of the campaign is the nature of those deaths. Only 106 men were killed in combat with the French. The rest, over 97% of the fatalities, were victims of disease. They died shaking with fever, their lungs filled with fluid, their bodies wasted by dysentery. It was a massacre by microbe. But the death toll was only half the story. Nearly 12,000 men were invalided home, their health permanently wrecked. The Walcheren fever, likely a strain of malaria, stayed in the blood. For years afterward, veterans of the campaign would suffer from recurring bouts of debilitating shakes and fever. The expedition didn't just kill 4,000 men, it crippled a generation of soldiers. When the Duke of Wellington later looked for reinforcements for his campaigns in Spain and Portugal, he found entire battalions that were Walcheren wrecks, men physically unfit for the rigours of the Peninsular War. The ghost of Walcheren would haunt the British Army for a decade. Back in England, as the ships unloaded their cargo of sick and dying men, the initial confusion turned to horror, and then to a white-hot fury. The public had been promised a glorious victory. Instead, they watched as thousands of their sons were returned to them in coffins or as invalids. The newspapers, initially supportive, turned savage. They published accounts of the squalor in the hospitals, the lack of medicine, and the incompetence of the commanders. The grand expedition was branded a national disgrace. The political fallout was immediate and explosive. The government of the Duke of Portland, already shaky, collapsed under the weight of the disaster. The blame game in Westminster became a spectacle of its own. Lord Castlereagh, the architect of the plan, and George Canning, the Foreign Secretary, turned on each other with vicious intensity. Their feud escalated beyond political manoeuvring into personal hatred, culminating in a duel on Putney Heath. It was a fittingly absurd end to an absurd campaign. Two of the most powerful men in the British Empire shooting at each other with pistols, while the army they sent to war lay dying in the mud. Canning was shot in the thigh. Castlereagh resigned in disgrace, and the government fell. Walcheren had not only destroyed an army, it had brought down a government. In January 1810, the battlefield shifted from the fever-ridden swamps of Walcheren to the oak-panelled chambers of the House of Commons. The British public, fueled by a potent mixture of grief and fury, demanded accountability. They wanted to know how an expedition of such unprecedented scale and expense could result in such total disaster without a major battle being fought. The parliamentary inquiry that followed became a national spectacle, a forensic dissection of failure that laid bare the incompetence, arrogance, and systemic negligence of the nation's leadership. Day after day, the architects of the calamity were summoned to testify. The Earl of Chatham, stripping away the last vestiges of his military dignity, attempted to deflect blame onto the Navy. He submitted a private narrative to the King, a breach of protocol that scandalized Parliament, in which he accused Admiral Strachan of causing the delays that doomed the campaign. Strachan, furious and blunt, retaliated with his own accounts, painting a picture of an army commander paralyzed by indecision, waiting for the tide to turn, while his men rotted in the rain. The public watched as the two commanders fought a paper war in the press, trading insults and accusations, while the graves in Walcheren were still fresh. It was a sordid display that diminished the standing of the entire military establishment. However, the most damning testimony came not from the generals or the admirals, but from the medical men. The inquiry drilled into the question that haunted every grieving family. Was this disaster foreseeable? The answers were devastating. It was revealed that the fever season of the Scheldt estuary was a well-documented geographical fact, known to locals and recorded in medical texts for over a century. Sir Lucas Pepys, the physician general, was forced to admit that he had not been consulted regarding the health risks of the operation until it was far too late. The planners had possessed the data, they simply chose to ignore it. They had sent 40,000 men into a known biological hazard zone at the precise time of year when it was most lethal, without providing the necessary quinine to treat the inevitable outbreak. The revelations painted a picture of a government blinded by hubris. The cabinet had been so fixated on the geopolitical chessboard, on the grand movements of ships and divisions, that they had forgotten the biological realities of the human instrument. They assumed that a British soldier was a machine that could operate anywhere, regardless of the environment. The inquiry exposed this as a fatal fallacy. It highlighted a disconnect between the strategic planners in Whitehall, who moved flags on a map, and the logistical realities of the polders. The English sickness was not an act of God, it was a consequence of administrative negligence. Though the new government managed to survive the vote of censure by a narrow margin, largely through political manoeuvring and the closing of ranks, the moral verdict was clear. The reputation of the Earl of Chatham was irretrievably destroyed. He would never hold active command again. The expedition was branded as a cautionary tale of what happens when political desperation overrides military prudence. The inquiry served as a grim post-mortem, cataloguing every missed opportunity, every delayed order, and every missing crate of medicine. It was a public shaming that seared the memory of Walcheren into the national consciousness, not as a glorious defeat against overwhelming odds, but as a senseless waste of life caused by the invincible ignorance of those in power. History, in its cruelty, often prefers to remember the triumphs of the battlefield, the charge of the Light Brigade, the square formations at Waterloo, the thin red line. It tends to forget the quiet, shivering deaths in the mud. Yet, the Walcheren expedition, for all its ignominy, left a legacy that shaped the future of the British Army more profoundly than many victories. It was a crucible of failure from which hard, necessary lessons were drawn. Lessons that would eventually forge the instrument that defeated Napoleon. The most immediate student of this disaster was a commander fighting far to the south, in the arid heat of the Iberian Peninsula. Sir Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington. He watched the calamity unfold from afar with a keen, analytical eye. Wellington had narrowly avoided being appointed to command the Walcheren force, a twist of fate that likely saved his career and arguably the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars. He saw clearly what Chatham had missed, that an army is a biological entity as much as a military one. He realized that before a general can defeat the enemy, he must defeat the environment. The English sickness confirmed Wellington's obsession with logistics and supply. In his future campaigns, the preservation of his soldiers' health became a paramount strategic concern, leading him to famously remark that his primary duty was not just to fight battles, but to keep his army fed, clothed, and out of the hospital. The ghosts of Walcheren marched with him, a silent warning against the hubris of neglecting the basic needs of the soldier. Structurally, the disaster forced a painful overhaul of the British military administration. The scandalous revelations of the parliamentary inquiry made it impossible to maintain the status quo. The incompetent medical board, which had failed to provide quinine and bedding, was eventually disbanded and restructured. The commissariat, the department responsible for supplies, began a slow, painful process of professionalization. It was the beginning of the end for the aristocratic amateurism that had characterized 18th century command. The army began to understand that logistics was not a lowly trade for merchants, but the very lifeblood of warfare. It was a lesson bought at the terrible price of 4,000 lives. But it meant that the armies which later marched into France in 1814 were better fed, better clothed, and better cared for than the doomed host that had sailed for the Scheldt. However, the memory of Walcheren faded from public consciousness with surprising speed, eclipsed by the brilliance of subsequent victories. The narrative of the Napoleonic Wars became dominated by the Peninsula and the climax of Waterloo. The 40,000 men who shivered in the Dutch polders became an embarrassing footnote, an awkward pause in the national myth of invincibility. The mass graves on Walcheren were left unmarked, reclaiming the land for the farmers and the sea. The fortifications of Flushing were rebuilt, the flooded fields drained, and life returned to normal. The English sickness retreated into the medical textbooks, a grim case study of malaria in Northern Europe. Yet, for the historian, Walcheren remains a vital, if tragic, chapter. It stands as a timeless monument to the dangers of strategic, wishful thinking. It exposes the peril of politicians believing that sheer will and vast expenditure can overcome the realities of geography and biology. The British cabinet wanted a second front. They wanted a victory to shore up a failing alliance. In their desperation, they ignored the map, they ignored the calendar, and they ignored the warnings of their own doctors. They sent the largest army of the age to fight a war against nature. And nature won. Today, the Walcheren expedition serves as a haunting reminder that the greatest enemy in war is often not the opposing army, but the arrogance of one's own commanders. The English sickness was not merely a fever of the blood, it was a fever of the mind, a delusion that plans drawn in London would inevitably succeed simply because they were British. The 4,000 men who lie beneath the Dutch soil are the silent witnesses to this truth. They did not die for glory, nor did they die to save their country. They died because their leaders forgot that in the grim calculus of war, the most formidable foe is often the one you cannot see, cannot shoot, and cannot command. The Walcheren expedition was meant to be the hammer blow that shattered Napoleon's empire. Instead, it became a self-inflicted wound that nearly bled Britain dry. It is a story of grand ambition colliding with grim reality, a testament to how easily the mightiest war machine can be dismantled by a microscopic enemy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most catastrophic military blunders, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories from the Redcoat era, uncovering the triumphs and the tragedies of the British Empire. What do you think was the biggest failure of the expedition? Was it the lethargic leadership of Lord Chatham, the lack of medical supplies, or the sheer hubris of the plan itself? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.